in which our lovers begin to learn the consequences of their actions. Chapter 25. There was no railway or post road to the Surov district, and Levine drove there with his own horses in the Tarantass. Halfway there, he stopped for feeding at a wealthy muzhik's, a fresh, bald old man with a broad red beard, gray at the cheeks, opened the gates, pressing himself to the post to let the troika pass. Directing the coachman to a place under a shed in the big, clean, and tidy new yard, with fire-hardened wooden plows in it, the old man invited Levine in. A cleanly dressed young woman, galoshes on her bare feet, was bending over, wiping the floor in the new front hall. Frightened of the dog that came running in with Levine, she cried out, but immediately laughed at her fright, learning that the dog would not touch her. Pointing Levine to the inner door with her bared arm, she bent again, hiding her handsome face, and went on washing. "The samovar, maybe?" she asked. "Yes, please." The room was big, with a Dutch stove and a partition. Under the icon stood a table with painted decorations, a bench, and 2 chairs. By the entrance was a small cupboard. The shutters were closed, the flies were few, and it was so clean that Levine took care that Laska, who had been running in the road and bathing in puddles, should not dirty the floor, pointing her to a place in the corner by the door. After looking round the room, Levine went out to the backyard. The comely young woman in galoshes, empty buckets swinging on the yoke, ran ahead of him to fetch water from the well. "Look lively," the old man shouted merrily after her, and came up to Levine. "Well, sir, are you on your way to see Nikolai Ivanovich Zviazhsky? He stops here too," he began garrulously, leaning on the porch rail. In the middle of the old man's story of his acquaintance with Zviazhsky, the gates creaked again, and the field workers drove into the yard with plows and harrows. The horses hitched to the plows and harrows were well fed and large. 2 of the workers were apparently family members, young men in cotton shirts and peaked caps. The other 2 were hired men in hempen shirts, one an old man and the other a young lad. Leaving the porch, the old man went to the horses and began to unhitch them. "What have you been plowing?" asked Levine. "Earthing up the potatoes. We've also got a bit of land. You, Fedo, don't turn the gelding loose. Put him into the trough. We'll hitch up another one." "Say, father, what about those plowshares I asked you to get? Have you brought them?" asked a tall, strapping fellow, apparently the old man's son. "They're in the sledge," replied the old man, coiling the unhitched reins and throwing them on the ground. "Set them up while we're having dinner." The comely young woman, with full buckets weighing down her shoulders, went into the front hall. Other women appeared from somewhere, young, beautiful, middle-aged, and old ugly ones, with and without children. The samovar chimney hummed. The workers and family members, finished with the horses, went to have dinner. Levine got his own provisions from the carriage and invited the old man to have tea with him. "Why, we've already had tea today," said the old man, accepting the invitation with obvious pleasure. "Or just for company." Over tea, Levine learned the whole story of the old man's farming. 10 years ago, the old man had rented 320 acres from a lady landowner, and last year he had bought them and rented 800 more from a local landowner. A small portion of the land, the worst, he rented out, and he himself plowed some 100 acres with his family and 2 hired men. The old man complained that things were going poorly, but Levine understood that he was complaining only for propriety's sake, and that his farm was flourishing. If it had been going poorly, he would not have bought land at 40 rubles an acre, would not have got 3 sons and a nephew married, would not have rebuilt twice after fires, each time better than before. Despite the old man's complaints, it was clear that he was justifiably proud of his prosperity, proud of his sons, nephews, daughters-in-law, horses, cows, and especially that the whole farm held together. From talking with the old man, Levine learned that he was also not against innovations. He had planted a lot of potatoes, and his potatoes, which Levine had noticed driving up, had already flowered and were beginning to set, while Levine's were just beginning to flower. He had plowed for the potatoes with an iron plow, which he called a plower, borrowed from a landowner. He sowed wheat. A small detail especially struck Levine, that as he thinned his rye, he gave the thin stalks to the horses. So many times, seeing this excellent feed go to waste, Levine had wanted to gather it, but it had always proved impossible. Yet with the music it got done, and he could not praise this feat enough. Don't the women folk need work? They carry the piles to the road, and the cart drives up. And for us landowners, things go badly with our hired men, said Levine, handing him a glass of tea. Thank you, the old man replied, took the glass but refused sugar, pointing to the nibbled lump he had left. Where are you going to get with hired men? He said. It's sheer ruin. Take the Shviazkis even. We know their land black as poppy seed, but they can't boast of their crops either. There's always some oversight. But you do your farming with hired men. And that's between musics. We can make do on our own. Bad work? Out you go, we'll manage. Father, Finnegan says to fetch some tar, the woman in galoshes said, coming in. So there, sir, said the old man, getting up and crossing himself lengthily. He thanked Levine and left. When Levine went into the kitchen side of the cottage to call his coachman, he saw all the men of the family at the table. The women served standing. The strapping young son, with his mouth full of kasha, was telling some funny story, and they were all laughing, and the woman in galoshes laughed especially gaily as she added more she to the bowl. It might very well be that the comely face of the woman in galoshes contributed greatly to the impression of well-being that this pleasant home made on Levine, but the impression was so strong that he could not get rid of it, and all the way from the old man to Zviashki he kept recalling this household, as if something in this impression called for his special attention. If you enjoy this format, please leave a like and subscribe and return tomorrow for the next chapter.